And now we are on the air. Okay, so why don't we introduce ourselves? Why don't you go first?
All right, Chris Crogan. I'm an undergraduate student at UMass Dartmouth studying computer science and philosophy.
Okay, and I am Professor Pete Mandik at William Patterson University, and I teach classes in philosophy of mind and logic and philosophy of science and related topics. And so we're here to discuss your paper. Do you want to start with a brief summary of the paper?
Yeah. So the paper, I believe I sent it in with the title "Minds, Brains, and Contents." It's changed. It's been going. I've been writing this for about a year now,
Okay.
and I've changed the title a few times, so I had to check the title. But it's basically I'm trying to do an argument against John Searle's Chinese Room. I'm trying to argue that a computational theory of mind is possible, and that syntax, basically that there can be what we think of as semantic content. The contents of our minds is represented by a syntactic structure. I do this. I use a few different models in computer science and modern neuroscience to try to argue this. I argue kind of along what Searle identifies as the mix between the robotics reply and the systems reply. And basically, there's a number of researchers who have identified in the human mind, just looking at the way we process, young children especially, but just the way humans learn, we process it. The ways we process that can be very easily modeled with things like Bayes nets. Neural networks are a model used in computer science that are based off of the way the brain works, and neural networks have been very successful recently in creating learning machines. And then I use a framework for neurosemantics that I argue represents, well, not I, others have argued, represents the way we do the way our syntactic structures in the brain produce semantics in our mind. And using those, I argue that John Searle's Chinese Room is insufficient.
Okay. Do you wanna say a little bit more about how the argument goes? In your paper you talk about what kind of according to you, you think there are some computational systems that the Chinese room argument is successful against, but that you are focusing on computational systems that you think are invulnerable to the Chinese room argument. I mean, do you think that's a fair description of your argument?
Yes, I believe that when Searle wrote the Chinese Room argument, there was a lot of thought in artificial. We could make this program that would be the program of intelligence, and that we could put this program on any system, and that system would become as intelligent as you or I. And he was arguing against that, and I do believe that there are necessary requirements before a computational system can be intelligent. And I think Searle was successful in pointing out, for the laptop sitting in front of me, in order to become intelligent, there's a lot it needs to be able to do. It needs to be able to have an intentional relationship with some sort of environment. And what that environment would have to be, what that environment would be, it could be loosely interpreted, but there has to be, for it to be intelligent in a context, it has to be able to interact with that context intentionally. That's the framework for syntactic contents that was presented by Professor Elias' method that I cite in the paper, one of the things he says is that the difference between information and content is that um, the content has to be basically the system has to be able to interact with it. Not really.
Right. So, you know, one way to talk about this is in terms of, are you familiar with the classic brain in a vat thought experiment?
Yes.
And now there's a version of the brain in the vat thought experiment whereby the brain in question has just popped into existence. It has no causal history. It is just, you know, if you think of a brain as a finite number of atoms, then you can calculate the probability that such a number of atoms will come together and form a brain. There's a non-zero probability. It's not impossible that a bunch of atoms, just like it's not impossible that all the atoms in the air of this room will just at random collect into the corner of the room, and then I would suffocate because there's no air where I need it to be. There's a non-zero probability that the atoms will do that at random. There's a non-zero probability that a bunch of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen in my backyard will just spontaneously form a brain that is intrinsically the same as my brain. And as far as what's going on internally, it's similar to what's going on in my brain. And there's one way of thinking about what semantic content is that it depends on certain kinds of causal relations to the environment, maybe historical causal relations to the environment, and this hypothetical, spontaneously arising brain wouldn't have those historical relations. And so even though the brain that just popped into existence is, in terms of internal structure, just like my brain, it isn't able to think about things like, for example, sandwiches or Ferris wheels, because it hasn't had the appropriate causal history that would relate it to actual sandwiches in its environment or actual Ferris wheels. So even though I might be thinking about maybe one day going on a Ferris wheel and eating a sandwich, the brain, according to a certain approach to psychosemantics or neurosemantics, this spontaneously arising brain, it wouldn't have that intentional content. I'm kind of curious, what do you think of that kind of brain in a vat thought experiment? Do you think that the relations to the environment that are crucial for semantic content wouldn't be instantiated in this spontaneously arising brain?
To be honest, I don't know exactly how to respond to thought experiments like that. I'm kind of on the fence.
Okay.
Because the way from the way I see it, it would depend on how the brain works and things about the brain that I don't fully understand. But I would say it's definitely an interesting question. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that.
So, you know, there's one way of describing the sorts of issues that that your paper is about, and that the Searle argument concerns, and that is in terms of the vocabulary that you were using just a little bit ago of syntax and semantics. And you can frame this question about whether whether there's any set of syntactical relations or syntactical operations that would suffice for there to be semantics. So, you know, I think maybe lots of people might agree that not just any old syntax will do. You know, just because you have some kind of physical system that you could describe as following certain rules or having certain kind of rule-governed behavior, that might suffice for syntax, but that wouldn't automatically suffice for semantics. But the one way of framing the question of whether artificial intelligence is possible is whether there's there's like at least one syntactic system that, in virtue of having the particular kind of syntactical operations that it has, would thereby suffice to have um, semantic content. And now, I mean, this raises a whole bunch of questions, and one of them is, well, really, what is syntax? And one way of thinking about what syntax is supposed to be is in terms of something like intrinsic structures and causal relations between parts of an intrinsic structure. So, for example, if we think about the robot reply to the Searle argument, the robot reply says, well, the Chinese room by itself, that wouldn't have any kind of that wouldn't give rise to any semantic content. But if you took the Chinese room and you stuck it in a robot so that it was the things that were going on in the room were responding to inputs that were coming in through cameras, and the things that were going out of the room were ultimately driving arms and legs and allowing this robot to move around in its environment. Then you would take the Chinese room, and it would be embodied, and it would be embedded in an environment. It'd be responding to an environment. And so, like, one thing you might say is that in the Chinese room prior to being stuck in the robot and the Chinese room after the robot, in each case you've got the same set of syntactic relations. One way of thinking about what syntax is it's just the set of relations between the symbols that are inside the room, and there's no difference about those intrinsic structural properties of what's going on inside of the room. What changes is that when you take the room and you stick it in the robot, now a symbol is ultimately being caused because the robot's camera is pointing at a tree instead of pointing at a river or a stream. And in virtue of these kinds of causal relations that lead to the outside of the robot's body, this inner syntactic item now takes on this semantic content. But the inner syntactic item, it's not doing anything different than it would have been or could have been doing prior to sticking the Chinese room into a robot. So one way of thinking about what syntax is, it's the sort of stuff that would be going on in the Chinese room, regardless of whether the Chinese room was inside of a robot or not. And to relate this to brains, you might think then that my brain and the hypothetical isomorphic brain that just has no causal history, it just popped into existence at random in my backyard, that both my brain and that hypothetical just born a few seconds ago brain, they're syntactically identical. They have the exact same they have this exact same intrinsic states. The intrinsic states are causally related to one another in exactly the same ways. So I'm just maybe I should pause there and ask you, what do you think of that characterization of syntax? Do you think that's a good way of thinking about syntax, to say that the two Chinese rooms are syntactically the same, or the two brains are syntactically the same?
Yeah, I think that would be fair to say that they are syntactically the same.
So now if you were to say that, and you were agnostic about this, so just to be fair, but if you were to say that the brain that's in a body and has a certain kind of causal relation to an environment, it gives rise to semantic content, but the just born brain doesn't. or if you similarly were to say that unless you stick it in a robot body, a Chinese room is not going to give rise to semantic content. One way I mean, you may not be committed to that view. You said you were kind of agnostic about the brain case that I gave you. But if you were to say that just the unembodied Chinese room or the brain that had no history, they wouldn't have any semantic content. But the other brain, the brain that was in the body and the robot, they would have semantic content. One way of describing that is not in terms of saying that syntax would suffice for semantics. There's that it's syntax plus something else, but it's not syntax by itself, because we're describing this in such a way that syntactically the two Chinese rooms are identical, and syntactically the two brains are identical. So if you are tempted to describe these situations in that way, then maybe you don't want to describe your position as saying that there's any kind of syntax that would suffice for semantic content. That instead, what would suffice for semantic content is a certain set of syntactic relations plus this extra stuff. The extra stuff is stuff that would lead from what's going on inside of the brain or inside of the computer to what's going on in the body of the robot and or the states of the environment. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I do think it's one thing that when I submitted this paper was originally longer, and I trimmed it down to meet the requirement for the submission. And there was a section that it looks like I took out on embodiment, the necessity of embodiment, and I do believe that embodiment is probably essential. I'll go with probably essential. It seems like embodiment is essential for semantics, given the understanding of semantics as an intentional relation, which we usually assume. So I would say that in the case with the Chinese room not embodied in a robot, as well as the brain not embodied in a body, that their systems probably have the capability. Of given sufficient programming in the Chinese room, and given in the program, given sufficient conditions in the brain, they would have the ability to produce semantic content if they had the embodied ability to gather those inputs and get, like, the input. The body is essentially the input-output system.
Yeah.
Everything we know about the environment, everything that goes into the brain comes from our senses and our interaction with the environment, and our outputs are behaviors. So without either of those things, it wouldn't be able to. It wouldn't be able to do anything, because input-output.
So, one thing I wonder about your arguments is what would Searle say about them? Would he throw up his hands and say, "Ah, you got me," or would he have some kind of counter argument? And I'm betting that he probably would have some kind of counter argument. That's usually how it goes in philosophy, right? No one is ever convinced of anything.
I'm sure he could come up with something
by anybody. And one sort of thing that I imagine his response would be kind of similar to what he already says about, for example, the robot response, or the. I mean, he does talk about the robot response, doesn't he? I do remember.
I believe he coined the term. It was. I believe that he's the one who named it the robot reply. I know in a couple of his papers he mentions it.
My memory of his response to the robot reply is a little blurry, but I do have a clear memory of his response to the systems reply. The systems reply, says, okay, right, John Searle in the Chinese room. John Searle doesn't understand Chinese, but the whole system does understand Chinese, and the whole system is this larger thing that has John Searle as just a proper part. The larger thing includes, in addition to John Searle, it includes the rule book that he's consulting. It includes the various Chinese symbols that he's looking at. It includes the symbols that are coming in through the input slots and the symbols that he's sending out through the output slots. And his response to that systems reply that says the whole system that has intentionality or understanding, he says, well, I can imagine internalizing all of that. So instead of writing things down on pieces of paper, I just memorize all that sort of stuff, so that when in theory, it's possible for me, John Searle, to memorize all the rules in the book, including all the illustrations that are in the book, so that when you show me a Chinese character, I can just think back through my memory palace like Sherlock Holmes and find the right symbol and find the right instruction that will lead me in my memory palace to the other room where I get the other symbol, and then I write the correct answer on a piece of paper. I could do all of that. It's happening inside of me, and so now there isn't this external thing that you could say is the whole system that of which I'm just a proper part. I am the whole system, and I still don't understand Chinese. I'm doing all the things that a functionalist or a AI advocate would say would suffice for understanding Chinese. I'm doing all those things, but I still don't understand Chinese. I don't quite recall what the robot. What was his reply to the robot? The robot
From my
response.
memory, it was pretty similar to the reply to the system's reply.
Was it that he just imagines what?
It was the robot reply. Basically, so with the robot reply, everything the Chinese symbols are encoding, essentially encoding sensory data, and I could be wrong on this. I could be misremembering.
And he's like the pilot of the robot, right? And so
Yeah.
he's doing all the stuff that would allow the robot to, from the outside observer, it seems like the robot understands Chinese, but on the inside there is no Chinese understanding. On the inside, there's just John Searle, like the little green guy in Men in Black. There's that one. They open up that like robot's face, and there's like a little green alien driving the robot.
Yeah.
That's John Searle. He's little green philosopher, John Searle, and so I'm inclined that if we're remembering the robot reply correctly, I'm inclined to think that Searle would just press that reply again against your favorite computational systems. He would say, I don't care what kind of computer you're talking about. If it's not a brain, then it's still a computer, and I could do all those things that the computer is doing. It doesn't matter if you stick it inside of a robot or not. I could do all the things that it's doing, and I still wouldn't understand Chinese. And so, therefore, whatever it is doing, that doesn't suffice for understanding Chinese. I suspect that that's what he would say.
Yeah. I suspect as much as well. My counter argument would be that one of the difficulties with the robotics reply is that we're essentially no longer talking about understanding Chinese, because to view the robotics reply, to view the system within the scope of the to view a robot within the scope of the Chinese room, what's coming in are Chinese symbols. That information is coming from the robot sensory systems, which have themselves taken in information about the environment and encoded it into something. And if that encoding is Chinese symbols, that doesn't mean the encoding doesn't have to have anything to do with with the original input, as long as the system can decode it, and from that decoding, gain an understanding of the original input. So it's essentially functional, where it doesn't really matter how it's encoded, because as long as you can go from A to B and back to A, uh, it works. The system works. Um, and that's where the framework, the content framework that I talk about here comes in, where I use as an example, and I got this from a couple of other guys, Parisian and Staggered use the Elias Smith framework in the context of Stanley, the the robotic car that won the DARPA Grand Challenge back in 2005, I believe. And they basically argue that using this system, the robot was able to have semantic content by means of, like, if you use this framework. And I agree with their assessment of it, and I use that as part of my argument paper. And basically, what the system did was it takes all the sensory information in, and it encodes it, and uses a bunch of computers. It uses uses Bayes networks, which have been seen to be have been compared to the brain for the way we learn. And using all of these systems, it produces information about its world. And it was able to successfully navigate this course. And it did it intelligently, and it represented the world. It created a model of the world, and this representation is at the very least analogous to semantic content.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep on trying to pretend to be Searle here and give you a hard time about Stanley the robot. So part of what you're saying is let's shift our focus from understanding Chinese to something else, like, for example, having perceptual contents in response to the environment. Right? Is that right? Is that fair?
Yes, I guess. Yeah.
And Stanley was a DARPA robot, and I think there's like YouTube videos people can watch of some of these things, right? These are like autonomous, like cars, right? That are able to.
The Volkswagen Touareg. I'm sure if you Google Stanley DARPA, you'll definitely find pictures of it.
And so let's take, I wonder what would be. If Stanley did have mental states, what would be the contents of those mental states? Would it be something like knowing how to get to the finish line, or recognizing that something was an obstacle? Would it be something like that?
Recognizing that this is a road, this is not a road, this is where the road ends.
Okay, so now here's how to do something like a Chinese room, or a Searle kind of argument against that. I'm going to change the example kind of slightly, but suppose we had a robot that was programmed to recognize faces, and so we show the robot, a picture of your face, and we tell the robot, okay, that's Chris Crogan, and we show it a picture of my face, and we say that's Pete Mandik, and then we train it on like 100 different faces, and it gets pretty good. As far as behaviorally, the way it behaves is about the way that a human would behave, who you would be tempted to describe as really good at recognizing faces. Like they could, some people, you probably have friends that are like this. They're just like really good at recognizing celebrities. You're like, who's that guy? And they're like, oh, I know, it's John Smith, and they always get it right. They're super recognizers. And so imagine this. Imagine we got around Searle, and John Searle has never laid eyes on you. He's never seen you with his naked eyes, and he's never seen a photograph of you, and neither has he seen me. He's never been introduced to me, never laid eyes on me or any photograph of me. And he's inside the room, and what is he doing? He's manipulating representations that none of them themselves look like you or look like me. And and he's driving this robot around, and the robot is producing sounds that sound like, the robot points and says, "That's Chris Crogan. Hi, Chris. Good to see you again," says the robot. "That guy over there is Pete Mandik," says the robot. And inside the room, it's just Searle's just pushing buttons and stuff. And if you took Searle out of the room and you showed him me or a picture of me, or if you showed him you or a picture of you and said, "Do you recognize these guys?" He would say no. If you asked him, "Who are these guys?" he would say, "I don't know. I've never seen them before." So that's we're not talking about understanding Chinese. We're talking about a different kind of mental state now. But it's a kind of it's still a kind of knowledge, I guess. In the case of understanding Chinese, you know what the person is saying. In the case of facial recognition, you know whether you've seen that face before, and you might know even further who that face is. Identifying information and can apply it a visual presentation of the face. So, John Searle, he himself doesn't know who you are, and he doesn't recognize who you are, but he's pushing the buttons inside of the robot, and the robot is making these behaviors that would, on the outside, would seem like he's pretty good at recognizing faces. It seems to me John Searle would just give the same argument again. He would say, you know what, like this this shows that artificial intelligence is baloney. That I could do all the things that you're saying would suffice for recognizing faces, but this shows that doesn't suffice, because I could do that without myself knowing who you are. I could do that without being able to recognize your face.
Well, I think maybe not the original robotics reply, but possibly the original robotics reply, and at least my response here. One of the key things is that the robot is more than just the computer. It's more than just the arithmetic logic unit in the computer that's manipulating all of the bits that represent all of it. So in this example, Searle is in there pushing the buttons.
Yeah.
There was a study. I can't remember who did the study. I remember reading about it. There was a study they did that they had people. They were using fMRIs, and they had people push a button. Or no, I don't even know if they pushed a button. They told people to look for. They gave them a bunch of pictures of celebrities, and they said, "Look for Pamela Anderson." And they found a neuron that fired only when they were looking at photographs of Pamela Anderson. It also fired when they looked at the name Pamela Anderson just typed out, and it also fired when they had a sketch that looked like it. But it didn't fire for anything else.
Uh-huh.
If you look at that neuron doesn't know who Pamela Anderson is. It's firing, telling the brain as a whole who the face is. But it doesn't know. It's just responding to the neurons that are connected to it. The neurons leading up to it build up the potential, and then it fires. So it's not responding to the semantic content is not within it. It's within the whole system. And that's why kind of a robotic systems reply hybrid that I think gives us the best reply to the system, the Chinese realm.
The Pamela, the thing about the Pamela Anderson neurons is intriguing. I don't think anyone would want to say that the neuron by itself understands who Pamela Anderson is. Like we could take that neuron out and keep it alive in a petri dish, and we could stimulate it, give it a little electric shock, and that probably wouldn't suffice to be a system that is thereby thinking about Pamela Anderson. And so I'm with you on that one, and probably a neuron would have to be hooked up to a much larger system in order for there to be any recognition or awareness or thinking about Pamela Anderson. But there is, I think, an important question about like how much of the system. So, for example, you know, I could get a haircut, and you know, you could shave me bald, and you could cut my fingernails and toenails, and I'd still be able to think about Pamela Anderson. You could chop off my arms and legs, and I'd still be able to think about Pamela Anderson, right?
Yeah,
I mean, please don't do that, but I'm begging you. But you know, probably that wouldn't affect my ability to think about Pamela Anderson. And we could, you know what, we could get rid of Pamela Anderson. Not that I'm recommending anyone bring any harm to Pamela Anderson, but if she just exploded, stopped existing, I don't. That's fine. I don't need her anymore. I can still think about Pamela Anderson. So it seems like there's a lot of stuff that is dispensable, and you know, the single neuron doesn't seem like enough. But do we really need the whole body and the whole environment, including Pamela Anderson? That seems too extreme. Also, it seems like we need something a little bit smaller and a little bit more narrow. But how small and how narrow? That's a really, really tough question. Well, you know, one thing I suspect about all the John Searle stuff, and you know, you and I agree that ultimately artificial intelligence is great. There's at least some artificial systems that would suffice for intentionality, and we both agree that ultimately, you know, the Searle argument isn't successful. I think we might disagree a bit about exactly what's wrong with the Searle argument, and maybe I could take some time now to say something about that. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
So, my suspicion about the Searle argument is that it's just way too strong. He, you know, he assumes that he himself has Chinese understanding, and I'm happy to grant him that. And he assumes that he has a brain and that he understands Chinese in virtue of his brain, and I guess I'm happy to grant him that also. But I suspect that his argument is actually way too strong. That you could use something like his argument to prove that, you know what, not even brains would suffice for Chinese understanding. If you really pushed it, I think you could use something like the Chinese argument to try to prove substance dualism, and I assume that that's a reductio ad absurdum. That if the Chinese room argument is proving substance dualism, that something has gone totally wrong. I don't think substance dualism is really a serious contender. And you know, one way of kind of thinking about the way the basic thing going on with the Chinese room argument is by comparing it to some very similar sorts of thought experiments in philosophy of mind. So one kind of thought experiment is the zombie thought experiment, and this is, you know, with the zombie thought experiment, you are looking at someone else, you're contemplating someone else, and you hypothesize that they're physically the same as you, they're behaviorally the same as you, and maybe even internally physically the same as you. And then you say, well, you know, conceivably there's just nothing going on in there. Even though they have all the same physical properties, they don't have the same mental properties. And another related thought experiment in philosophy of mind is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's thought experiment of the mill from his monadology. There's at one point in the monadology where he ultimately wants to defend a kind of idealism, but he's arguing against materialists like, for example, Hobbes, and he's saying, look, you know, these materialists, they think that what a mind is a brain, and that's just crazy, and here I'm going to show you how. If what a mind was a brain, that means that a mind would be a complex. It would be made out of multiple parts that are causally interacting. And I could imagine myself shrunk down, and I go inside of a brain as if I were walking around inside of a mill, like walking around inside of a factory. And all I would see would be these different mechanical pieces pushing and pulling one another. and I certainly wouldn't see anything that would suffice to explain anything mental. I wouldn't. In Leibniz's case, he focuses on perception. He says, I wouldn't see anything inside of this mill that would suffice to explain perception, and then he goes from there to say, therefore, minds have to be simple things, and what a mind really is a monad. It's a simple substance. The reason I want to compare these three thought experiments is to note some key similarities and differences. You know, with the zombie thought experiment, you're examining a person from the outside, from the third person point of view. You know, I might look at you and say, well, you know, Chris, you seem like you have a human body like me. You have eyes and you have a head, and yeah, you know, I bet you even have a brain. But for all I know, Chris, you don't have any kind of mental states. You don't have anything going on mentally. So I'm viewing someone from the outside. With the Leibniz argument, Leibniz shrinks down and he goes inside of the brain. So he's not viewing the brain from the outside; he's viewing it from the inside. But in both of these cases, there's something kind of passive. With Searle adds an extra ingredient. So not only is he going inside by going inside the Chinese room, he's doing what the artificial intelligence people and the functionalists say you should be doing. So, you know, Leibniz, when he's in the mill, he's not making the mill do anything. He's just observing it passively. But Searle becomes the mill. He does what the mill is supposed to be doing. And he says, aha, you know, it's not just me observing it and saying, I bet, you know, this could happen without there being any, without any understanding. I am doing it, and I know what I understand, and I know that I don't understand Chinese, even though I'm doing all the things that you artificial intelligence people say that I could do. So, you know, like part of what's crucial in the Searle argument is that he's doing the things that his opponents say you're supposed to be doing, and second, he is going in there with knowledge. In the zombie thought experiment, you don't really know. You're saying like, well, for all I know, and similarly with the Leibniz thought experiment, he's not saying he knows that there's no perception going on in the factory. He's saying that for all he knows that there's no perception. But the genius of the Searle argument is he claims to have knowledge. Like, I know that I don't understand Chinese, and I could nonetheless I could do all those things that are supposed to suffice, but since I still wouldn't know. And I think you could take that kind of argument and you could direct it at just plain old brains instead of a functional isomorph to a brain, just a brain. As long as the brain admits of some kind of like coarse-grained causal description, and it could be something pretty fine-grained. It could be something down at the level of molecules or whatever. Whatever you think it is that brains are doing, you could shrink down a Searle and you could have him do all those things. As long as you grant to him in the first place that he knows what he thinks he knows, he can always assert that he could do those things without having the knowledge of Chinese or the knowledge of faces. He could do the things, and so yeah, I think you could whatever you think brains are doing. And by the way, Searle, he claims to love brains, but he never tells us what's so great about brains. He doesn't tell us what brains are doing that computers couldn't do. I think if someone were to commit and were to say what brains are doing, then you could bring in a version of Searle that says, you know, I could do that too without understanding Chinese. And I think really the right way to respond to the Searle arguments is to just not grant that he has that kind of knowledge. And what's the kind of knowledge that he claims to have? He claims to, number one, know the inside of his own mind. And further, he claims to know the inside of his own mind across a wide range of counterfactual situations. So it's one thing to say like I know right now what I'm thinking. So like right now I know I'm thinking about my coffee cup. But it's another thing to say that I know that I would be thinking about my coffee cup if I was surfing on a wave of lava while standing on a titanium surfboard. Like that's a counterfactual situation. That's so that's a much stronger kind of knowledge than simply asserting knowledge of what's going on in the actual situation. So Searle is claiming to have a very strong kind of knowledge about his own mental states, and further, he's claiming that he knows what his knowledge would be across this wide range of counterfactual scenarios, really crazy scenarios in which he is, doing all of the stuff that anybody plausibly would say that a so-called Chinese understanding computer program would need to do, even if it is a lookup table instead of a neural network program. It's still going to be incredibly complicated, and it's just kind of a little bit ridiculous to think that Searle could do that in the first place. In the old-fashioned version of the room where he still has a book and the papers, but it's even more ridiculous in the version where he internalizes it. He memorizes the rule book and he memorizes the papers. So that's like this really, really, really far out scenario, and I don't think we should grant him that he still is an authority about what he would know. I think the way to think about this is to say that kind of first person methodology where you focus on what's going on the inside of your own mind and then try to reason about counterfactual scenarios. I think we should just say, you know what, that's garbage. Forget about that. Forget about the Chinese room. Let's think about intentionality from a third person point of view. And so, this brings us back to the sorts of stuff that you and I agree about. So, the kind of neurosemantic approach that Chris Eliasmith favors, or the kind of approach to artificial intelligence where you say, like, yeah, Stanley, the DARPA, what was it, Volkswagen,
Yeah.
DARPA mobile. Stanley the DARPA mobile. Yeah, Stanley has got intentional content. Stanley has knowledge. What does Stanley know? Stanley knows how to win the race. Stanley knows how to avoid obstacles. Stanley might be able to recognize that something is an obstacle and maybe thus, in some sense, have a concept of an obstacle. So it's got a certain kind of conceptual or propositional knowledge. It knows that. It knows that it has finished the race. It knows that the thing that it's looking at is an obstacle. And the criteria that we apply to Stanley are very much the criteria that we apply to one another. They're criteria that are answerable to these sorts of third-person accessible pieces of evidence. They're largely behavioral criteria. That's how we know. And the first person access that we have actually plays a relatively small role in propping all this up. And maybe I might even go so far as say something extreme that we do that afterwards. Like the people learn how to talk about themselves and have some kind of grasp on their own mental states after they are first conversant in these third-person applications of mental states. So I think that's the way to go against Searle, is to just kind of hit the ground running, blowing him off. and the thing to blow off is to blow off this kind of very strong first personalism, where you grant to Searle that he does know what's going on in his own mind in such a strong way that it's generalizable across a wide range of counterfactual scenarios. We just say, no, sorry, you don't know that. But what we do know is that of one another that we have mental states. We do know that. We know, look, I know that you have a mind and that you're intelligent and you're not just a lookup table. I know that. And how am I able to know that? Well, it's not because I scanned your brain, Chris. I didn't check to see if you have a brain. You might just have a bunch of microchips going on in there. You might be a cyborg. I don't care. It's fine by me. I'm not a chauvinist. And so that's the way I think ultimately, about the big items you and I agree on. but I think that we disagree about exactly what's wrong with Searle.
Yeah, I mean everything you just said sounded made sense. Especially the I completely agree with you on the fact that if Searle, the idea of memorizing this rulebook. In the argument, he says the rulebook is sufficiently complicated, or should be as sufficiently complicated as we think it needs to be to denote what we think intelligence would be. Well, the computer science people can write some complicated programs, and it would be very difficult to memorize, and possibly impossible to memorize. And if you did memorize it, I think it would completely change the way he viewed. I think it would change the way Searle viewed information if he was able to memorize something of that magnitude.
Yeah. So is there anything nice that we could say about Searle?
I think that the idea of semantics as a necessity for intelligence is incredibly important, and at the time was probably not given the weight it needed to be. I think that his argument is definitely something that we in the computer science field, the AI field, should consider, even if with a grain of salt, and should strive to overcome.
And how about the syntax and semantics distinction? Is that still?
I think syntax and semantics should be distinguished, but I'm not ready to accept that syntax. Well, I guess syntax. I do think that syntax with embodiment can lead to semantics. I don't think that syntax without embodiment can. So, yeah, I agree with him on that.
Let me ask you a slightly unrelated question, but I think we can tie it in. Would you allow yourself to be mind uploaded? Do you know about mind uploading?
I mean, I'm familiar with the concept. Yeah.
So we scan your brain. We scan your brain, and we take the information that we get from the brain scan, and we create a very high resolution computer simulation of your brain. So that any question we would ask you, this computer simulation would give the exact same answer that you would give. And so there's two questions about mind uploading. One is whether this computer simulation would have a mind, and then another question is whether it would have your mind, like whether that would be you. So that if something happened to you, like your brain died, you got in a car accident, or you fell in a volcano, or both, you have a backup, and you live on as this backed up file, and we could just boot you up, reboot this simulation, and you continue. So the reason I bring this up is because you sound like you're one of those embodiment people. You think embodiment is important, and one way of describing what's going on with this mind uploading thing is that we're getting rid of the body, and if you're a real strong embodiment proponent, you would say, yeah, sorry, that if you're leaving the body behind, that thing is not a mind in the first place, and so since it's not a mind in the first place, it's not going to be my mind.
I don't think it'd be my mind. As far as something happened to me, could clone me, download it. I'm not sure. I think they're very interesting. I think it's a very interesting thing to consider.
So you think it might be a mind, but you're not super sure.
I think if re-embodied, it's a mind. If you can re-embody it, it's a mind.
But what if instead of putting it in a body, like a robot body or whatever, we just put it in cyberspace and it interacts with virtual reality?
I think it's. I mean, I think that's a mine too. Earlier I said.
Okay.
I wasn't earlier. I was kind of stumbling over my words a little bit, and I was talking about environment, how it has to interact with its environment, whatever that might be. When I say whatever that might be, if you create a simulated environment and you have an intelligent agent program that is interacting with that environment, it is intelligent in the context of that environment, I would say, because and it's a body within the context of that environment. Um, the environment doesn't have to be the real world.
Okay. Well, that helps clarify what where you're coming from with the pro embodiment stuff. So we should probably wrap this up. I think we've gone for a full hour.
Okay.
Do you have any last words on Searle and artificial intelligence?
I think we covered most of it.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed this discussion. I thought this was really interesting. We covered a lot of interesting stuff, and I really enjoyed your paper, and I'm glad we had this opportunity to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I enjoy I enjoy and appreciate the feedback. So, because this is an ongoing, the work in progress. So.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and if you keep on working on this, I'd be happy to read later versions of it.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm gonna hit the stop broadcast button, and we can call it a wrap.
Okay.
Okay. It's a wrap.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye bye.